Hello and welcome to this episode of Claranet Cybersecurity TV. My name is Ben Thornhill and I'm practice lead here at Claranet Cybersecurity. In this episode, we will be completing the OWASP Top 10 series by discussing A10, Insufficient Logging and Monitoring. I'll start with a brief introduction to the OWASP Top 10. I'll then hand over to my colleague Dan, a penetration tester here at Claranet Cybersecurity, who will describe what insufficient logging and monitoring means, how vulnerabilities related to this can be identified, prevented, and remediated. OWASP stands for Open Web Application Security Project, a non-profit organization whose objective is to provide cybersecurity guidance free of charge so that anybody can use the information to improve the security posture of their cyber systems. The top 10 list is what is considered to be the most critical web application security risks, and they provide this information within an awareness document. This slide lists the top 10 vulnerabilities covered in this series, and today we're going to be focusing on A10, insufficient logging and monitoring. Now over to Dan for the technical detail.
Last on the list of OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities is insufficient logging and monitoring. While this vulnerability does not allow an attacker to accomplish anything by itself, as part of a defense in depth strategy, it is often in practice a major driver in the severity of the impact of attacks. Where security events are not logged, or where logged events are not monitored, there is very little to prevent an attacker from spending hours, days, or even months targeting an application and trying a variety of different techniques to see if anything works. Assuming there is some exploitable vulnerability somewhere in the application, which is often a fair assumption to make, a lack of awareness of ongoing attacks increases the probability of the attacker finding the vulnerability to almost certain. Once an attack has been carried out, it may not be immediately apparent to the owner of the application. Some breaches can even take months to be found. Without a rigorous logging policy and incident response procedure, it is nearly impossible to identify where an attack came from, how they got in, or what data they may have had access to. To identify vulnerabilities as an attacker or penetration tester, if the application is treated as a black box where we have no knowledge of the back-end functions other than through the behavior we observe on the front end, it's very difficult to identify how much information is logged or how well monitored the application is. A simple test as a penetration tester is to set off a vulnerability scan without any whitelisting in place to see if you get blocked. If you get blocked, then at least an extremely obvious attack will be prevented by the protection system. If the scanner is allowed to continue without interference for a long period of time, then that could be an indicator that the application is not monitored for security incidents. Similarly, on a manual test, an attacker can simply attempt to send a couple of very common payloads and wait to see if their current IP gets blocked or there are any changes to the application's behavior. It doesn't necessarily tell the attacker whether their actions are being logged or not, but it does give them an idea of how closely the application is monitored for attacks. A much more effective method of identifying insufficient logging and monitoring vulnerabilities is from the inside with a white box approach, where you can see all the back-end structures. After a penetration test, you should be able to check the security logs and see enough information to understand where the penetration tester was attacking from and what their successful and unsuccessful attacks were. It should also be possible to infer what data, if any, they had successfully accessed. On a more individual level, which does not require the use of a penetration tester, an organization could set up a vulnerability scan on themselves or submit requests with common payloads and check to see if they get any security alerts from the activity. If you do, are you able to quickly identify whether the attack is malicious and block the sender if that is required? If not, how far do you need to dig to find evidence of the attack? With all vulnerabilities, it's important to consider the overall risk posed to the organization rather than simply looking at just the impact alone. Risk is typically described as a combination of impact and probability. It's very common for logging and monitoring to be less effective than it should be. Equally, these shortcomings are exploited every time an attacker tries any kind of payload, meaning that the overall probability of the vulnerability existing and it being exploited is very high. The impact is much harder to quantify for these vulnerabilities. Similar to not having insurance, there is no real consequence from a technological perspective, although there may be legal or compliance related issues, until another security incident happens. When an attacker manages a successful exploitation, then insufficient logging and monitoring will allow the attacker to exploit much further than if they were caught straight away, and also gives the attacker a better chance of not being caught at all. Overall, the risk to an organization posed by insufficient logging and monitoring is typically around a medium level, without taking any specific factors about an individual organization into account. Moving on to some examples of how a lack of monitoring and logging can impact an organization, we'll first take a look at a fairly common password spraying attack. First, we'll assume that an attacker is able to enumerate a list of valid users for the application. This could be from verbose error messages when login attempts fail, or from a number of entire user list leakage vulnerabilities that we see fairly often. Once a list of valid users has been obtained, an attacker can then begin spraying common passwords. This is a high traffic attack where the common password is tried on every valid account, hoping that some accounts will be using this common password. When an account is using the password, then the attacker is able to log in, and when the account is not using the password, then only a single failed login attempt is registered for that account. Many applications will only register a security event when there are multiple failed login attempts to the same account, but do not track how many failed login attempts come from the same IP address. This means that since the attacker does not focus on one account, the organization will get no warning that the attacker is performing any sort of attack. A few days later, once the remaining accounts have had a chance to cool off, the attacker may come back and attempt password spraying again with a different common password, again causing no security alerts while possibly guessing the correct password for one or two accounts. By repeating this process, the attacker may be able to find the correct password for many accounts over the course of days, weeks, or months. The second example system has a rigorous local security logging solution. Every attempted payload to exploit known vulnerabilities is caught and logged. Once per week, an administrator will log into the system and check the logs for any unusual activity, and take any actions needed when an attack has been detected. An attacker spends multiple days trying different payloads and trying to get access to the system. Many of these attempts are detected and entries placed into the security log. Eventually, the attacker will find a payload that the target is vulnerable to, and they gain access to the system. Spend the rest of the day performing nefarious actions on the system and achieve everything that they wanted to. But before logging out, they look through the logs of the system and delete any entries that relate to the attacks that they have attempted on the system, removing all obvious traces on the compromised system that they were there. When the administrator logs back in days later to conduct their weekly checks, they see that nothing is out of the ordinary, leading to the attack going unnoticed. In the final example, we'll be considering an attack from a malicious insider. This employee is one of many that has access to a large database for an application. This attacker is familiar with the internal logging policy and knows that they cannot delete log entries, but has thought of a workaround. A new database user is created, which will be used to carry out their attack. Once the attack is complete, the attacker then deletes the new account. In the logs, they know that all database queries are recorded, but database user actions are not. This means that when the event is investigated, the created database user is credited with all the malicious queries, but it's very difficult for the malicious employee to be tied to the creation of the new user. So to prevent all of the previous examples, in a nutshell, there needs to be a wide range of events logged for in-depth security investigations, with an accurate level of events being highlighted for immediate investigation through alerts. All login or access control failures should be logged, along with server-side validation failures, which are often a very accurate indicator of attempted attacks. Whenever a web application firewall is triggered, it should be logged, and alert levels set as per your organization's needs, but several triggers from the same source IP would be an example of an alert-worthy event. Where an event is logged, there should be enough additional information captured for investigation later, such as which user caused the event. Logs from many different sources can be difficult to keep track of. In an ideal world, they should all be able to be processed by a central log management solution to make it easier for your security team to identify real and immediate threats. Where high importance transactions take place, they should be traceable later, and the logs kept should be able to be checked for integrity to ensure that they have not been tampered with. Logs should not just be kept on the local machine that they are relevant to, but should instead be stored across the network or in the cloud too. This means that successful compromise of a host does not prevent effective logging.
Thanks, Dan. That's it from us. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the OWASP Top 10. Please make sure to check out the other episodes in this series. If you've watched the entire series, then thanks for listening, and we hope that you've enjoyed it. Please keep your eye on Claranet Cybersecurity TV for more content, discussions, and demonstrations. Goodbye for now. Stay safe, stay secure.